Chapter 3. First Families and Fresh Graves. Peyton Skipwith was born along with the 19th century in Virginia's Fluvanna County, on a tobacco plantation known as Bremo. The year 1800 was a momentous one. Just down the road, at his hilltop estate of Monticello, Thomas Jefferson contemplated his vision of a continental empire of white, freehold farmers in the wake of his electoral triumph over the forces of a recrudescent aristocracy. A day's ride in the other direction would have brought Skipwith to Richmond, a city still recovering from Gabriel Prosser's rebellion, a slave uprising of hundreds that had been thwarted at the last moment by a fortuitous thunderstorm washing out a bridge. Skipwith's fate would reveal that the timing and place of his birth were not without their measure of meaning. Little is known of his upbringing except that he, like Coker and Carey, was born into what were, for a slave, fortunate circumstances. Skipwith's mother was both plantation nurse and mammy to the planters' children. So rather than toiling in the tobacco fields and drying sheds, the boy was trained as an artisan, a stonemason in particular. More exceptional still, Skipwith, his siblings, and many of his fellow slaves were taught to read, write, and know their Bible in a schoolhouse built by his master, in defiance of state law and southern custom, and run by Bremo's mistress and a white schoolteacher from the north. Skipwith was part of a grand experiment. Like his neighbor Jefferson, John Hartwell Coke was the liberal and educated scion of plantation privilege who questioned the solidity of the foundation upon which that privilege rested. Unlike Jefferson, however, Coke had a plan as well as the means. A better businessman than the president, he did not mortgage his slaves, to put his ideals into action. But one obstacle stood in his way: what to do with the men and women whose freedom papers he planned to sign. Virginia law required that manumitted slaves leave the state, and few jurisdictions, in the North or the South, welcomed them. So a year after the American Colonization Society formed in 1816, Coke joined its local auxiliary. The experiment incubated for a generation. Then, one summer's day in 1833, Coke summoned Skipwith and told the 33-year-old father of 6 that he was granting the Mason his freedom, on the condition that he emigrate to Liberia. Skipwith demurred for several months. He may have heard of the appalling mortality rate among the colonists, even if he had not read the abolitionist literature that relentlessly played up this terrible fact. What he was certain of was that going to Liberia meant leaving his family behind, not his immediate one, for Coke planned to send them with him, but his siblings and his cousins and all the other kin that, as on plantations across the South, did so much to nurture and sustain body and soul against the brutality and capriciousness of the slave's life. But, in the end, the lure of freedom won out. On November 5, 1833, Peyton and his family set sail aboard the Jupiter, out of Norfolk, in the company of several white missionaries and 24 fellow emigrants. Skipwith and his family were part of a major shift in the demographics of immigrants to Liberia. During the first decade, free blacks, mostly out of the Upper South, but also from the North, made up the majority of the people dispatched by the ACS. Of the 3,160 colonists who set sail for Africa between 1820 and 1833, more than 1,700 were already free, just over 1,100 had been manumitted for the purposes of emigration. The remaining few hundred were Africans seized by federal authorities in their crackdown on international slave trafficking. Over the next 14 years, from 1833 through Liberia's independence from the ACS in 1847, 200 free blacks and 1,500 manumitted slaves, again mostly from the Upper South, left for Liberia. The shift was a product of the dying off of liberal planters who freed their slaves and their wills for the specific purpose of emigration, and of free blacks being swayed by the news of disease and death in Liberia as well as by abolitionist attacks on emigration as the humbuggery of the age. Thus more self-sufficient and, in some cases, financially secure free blacks and mulattoes were supplanted by largely impoverished, illiterate, and often dependent former slaves. Few planters put up a schoolhouse among the slave cabins, as Coke did. The impact on the society emerging at Meseraudo, as Peyton Skipwith was to discouragingly learn, was dramatic. By December 1833, when the Skipwith family arrived in Liberia and made their way up the stone wharf on the Meseraudo riverside of the Cape, Monrovia, or the America Place, as the natives referred to it, was a town on the make. But for the tropical foliage and the Atlantic Ocean, it might have struck a well-traveled American visitor as not unlike a promising new river town on the Mississippi. A few half-finished government buildings indicated the seriousness of the colonization endeavor, while large stone warehouses hinted at the mercantile cast of the local economy. Indeed, money was already leaving its imprint. The few large shingled houses of the merchant elite stood out amid a scattering of smaller dwellings barely more substantial than shacks. The populace, however, gave Monrovia an exoticism few American settlements could match, as half-naked day tribesmen, robed Mandingo traders, suited mulatto merchants, leather-aproned black American workers, and the occasional uniformed white U.S. Navy man mingled on the grid of broad grassy streets. These were part of the settlers' cultural baggage from America. Such streets allowed wagons to turn around, except that there were no wagons in Liberia because draft animals kept dying from a host of deadly tropical parasites. The Skipwiths, like other impoverished newcomers, were initially supported by the ACS with a guarantee of 6 months of provisions and housing in what officials called receptacles, communal housing for the newly arrived. The African-American missionary Augustus Washington offered a near-contemporary description of one of these places. It is an old shabby, rickety building, 1 story high, with a garret, and is built of brick. It contains 12 pens below and 4 garret apartments, about 6 feet by 9, having 1 small windows without glass. Within these rooms, I have seen nothing but an excuse for a bedstead made out of rough saplings lashed together with bark or rope. Some of these stalls contained each whole families of 6 to 10 and 14. Many, passing through the raw ordeal of acclimation. Indeed, every night a cacophony of coughs and moans and the stench of dysentery sufferers filled the receptacles. Even colonial officials admitted it was best for the bodily and mental health of the emigrants, as well as for the ACS's fiduciary responsibility, to get them into homes of their own as quickly as possible. Like many other emigrants, Skipwith was thoroughly discouraged by his initial impression of Liberia. But it was not so much the housing that left him and his wife, Lydia, dissatisfied as the larger social ills he diagnosed, of which his poor accommodations were a symptom. Less than 6 weeks after his arrival, Peyton wrote back to his former master of the divisions he had discerned in Monrovian society between those who had emigrated early and with resources and men like himself. "There is some that have come to this place that have got rich and a number that are suffering," he noted to Coke. Opportunities were scarce. There is no chance for farming in Monrovia for it is a solid body of stones. Of course, those stones could be put to good purposes by Skipwith, who had a highly useful skill in a place where wood quickly rotted and any building intended to last had to be built with stone. He admitted that his skills would be well compensated in Monrovia, but indicated that another obstacle might hold him back. "The sun is so hot that people from America cannot stand it in the dry season and in the wet it rains too much," he wrote, though he had yet to experience the latter. At the close of his first letter home, Skipwith implored his former master to let him return. "I want you if you please to write to me by the first opportunity and let me know, on what terms I can come back for I intend coming back as soon as I can." There was one consolation to starting a difficult new life in Liberia that Skipwith failed to mention but that many other recent arrivals noted, a sense of relief at being their own masters, an existential release from the burden of bondage. After his visit with the local white physician in Monrovia, Abraham Blackford, who emigrated a decade after Skipwith, wrote to his former mistress back in Fredericksburg, Virginia, "My conversation is to him when I call him as Dr. Louvenel, U.S. Agent Lucian Beale, and his to me in a reply, is, Mr. Blackford. It is much better, than to be in the state, where the practice is, for them to call you boy." Young Burwell Minor, who arrived in Monrovia around the same time as Skipwith, viscerally experienced his liberation. An older relation, James Minor, who had migrated shortly before him, described Burwell in a letter to his former master. When he, Burwell, first arrived, he acted like a young horse just out of the stable. He tested freedom. For Skipwith, by contrast, early disappointment became unremitting despair. The acclimating African fever, i.e., malaria, laid every member of his family low, and his 5-year-old daughter Felicia died from it soon after their arrival. Skipwith, because his eyes were fixed all day on rocks that reflected the blazing equatorial light of Africa, was afflicted with the blindness of nights, to the point where colonial doctors insisted he stop playing stone. But the worst of it came in July, when Lydia, his wife of more than 10 years, died of unknown causes. A jobless widower with 4 children to care for, Skipwith contemplated leaving for Sierra Leone and, if his health did not improve there, leaving Sierra Leone and returning to Virginia. Many emigrants suffered similar travails and setbacks. Early 19th century medical thinking attributed the source of the tropical diseases that felled so many newcomers to Africa, black Americans and white Europeans alike, to the nightly clouds of deadly miasma, smells and mists emanating from the decay of the region's abundant vegetative matter. Disease and death were as rife at Meseraudo as they had been at Campbell. According to a Dr. Henderson, in a report to the ACS Board in 1832, roughly 1 in 6 emigrants were dying of fever, that is, malaria, alone. The historian Eric Buren has described early Liberia as a charnel house. Gathering data from a host of ACS and other sources, he calculates that of the 2,887 African Americans who went to Liberia between 1831 and 1843, fully 42% died of disease, war with the natives, accidents, and the sundry dangers of settler life. As the colonist Thomas Brown wrote in 1834, Liberian graveyards always look fresh. The ACS and other colonization supporters in the United States responded to what one modern demographer has labeled the highest rate of mortality ever reliably recorded with cover-ups and excuses. At first, they denied that fever itself was harmful, repeatedly quoting a letter from Ashman stating that malaria was less a disease than a salutary effect of nature to accommodate the physical system of its subjects, by a safe and gentle process of attenuation, to the new influences of a tropical climate. When this reasoning no longer convinced anyone, they began to cite the equally appalling death rate in 17th-century Jamestown, writing Liberian deaths off as the price of pioneering a new land. Or they blamed the victims themselves. Many of those who arrived in the Harriet, an emigrant ship of 1829, owe their death to imprudent exposure during convalescence and a free indulgence in the fruits of the place, particularly the pineapple, noted the colonial agent Joseph Mecklin in a letter to the ACS board that was reprinted in the organization's newspaper, The African Repository. As Skipwith's experience revealed, however, disease was part of a cycle of poverty and poor health that crippled initiative among new emigrants. Rather than finding their feet during the 6 months they were housed and fed by the ACS, recently arrived colonists spent much of the time in bed or wandering the streets in a fever-induced daze. By the end of the half-year, they had often failed to become self-sufficient. Many remained too ill to work, and unable to buy food, they starved, which triggered relapses of malaria. Writing from the settlement at Grand Bassa, now Buchanan, Virgil McParran, who had taught himself medicine by treating fellow slaves on a North Carolina plantation, noted in an 1848 letter to his former master, "Everybody wants TRS but none can pay them. I have at this time 5 patients, and the 5 is not worth $5. The ACS did gradually make adjustments. Recognizing the deadly conditions caused by summer rains, the ACS and its auxiliaries moved embarkation dates to ensure that colonists arrived during the dry, though hotter, winter months. The society also discovered that Southerners, particularly those from U.S. coastal areas, where a milder form of malaria existed, survived a little better than blacks from the north, though they still regularly came down with, and died from, the more severe African variety. Thus mortality rates ebbed a bit with the shift in emigrants from free blacks to former slaves. The colonists also developed their own countermeasures. Whether brought from America or picked up from the natives, herbal remedies the colonists experimented with, including so-called fever tea, helped allay the fatal dehydration accompanying high fever and dysentery. But even though mortality rates dropped, poverty persisted. "The people in the colony are generally poor," reported Captain J.I. Nicholson of the U.S. Navy. After a visit to Monrovia in 1837, many of them were sent without anything of consequence, and others who had a little property have been obliged to expend it in consequence of sickness after the expiration of the 6-months, in which they drew rations from the society. The poorest of the poor ended up on public farms, where, noted the colony's black lieutenant governor, A. D. Williams, the poor, such of them at least as require charitable assistance, from the society's store, with the exception of 1 or 2 who were incapacitated by age or infirmities, are made to work. The selfless and energetic William Burke, manumitted and sent to Liberia by the future Civil War General Robert E. Lee, established an almshouse for the colony's many orphans and widows in the upriver settlement of Clay Ashland. "You are aware," he wrote the ACS Secretary Ralph Gurley in the 1850s, "that in many of the expeditions from the U.S. to this country there are old mothers and fathers at the head of large families of children, and those aged persons' constitution generally broken down. After arriving they like a butterfly flap about for a few days and then pass away, leaving their children to the mercy and cold cariety of the country, and particular the kind of cariety which might be expected in a new country where things are hard and inconvenient to come at, and where everyone feels that he has as much as he can do to look out for himself and family." But penury was not confined to newcomers alone. In an 1836 letter to the ACS, Jane Hawkins, who survived a stabbing during the battles of 1822, wrote that, "Our house scarcely shelters us from the torrents of rain which fall during the wet season, and but for the occasional help of those who remember the poor among us, we should not have so much of the common necessaries of life as to sustain nature." Visitors, officials, the ACS, and the colonists themselves disagreed as to the causes of the pervasive poverty. The ACS and its agents, as usual, blamed the settlers. Responding to tales of poverty and the abolitionist press, Mecklin, whose penchant for authoritarian dictates underscored his low estimation of the colonists, filed a report with the Board of Settler Indolence and Stupidity. "They have never when in the U states voluntarily labored for their own support, and now, when the stimulus of the overseer's lash is removed, cannot be induced to exert themselves sufficiently to procure even a scanty subsistence." Surprisingly, some of the colonists agreed. "It is true that it is very hot here," wrote Washington McDonough in 1842 of the settlement at Cedar Crew, about 120 miles down the coast from Meseraudo, "but if a man is industrious after he becomes acclimated, he may get along very well, but the most of the people that comes out here, by the time they get over the fever they become something like the natives and won't work if they find that they can get along by stealing." Not everyone associated with the ACS believed that the settlers were entirely at fault. The agent Ezekiel Skinner understood that ACS policy and practice bore at least some responsibility. "The people in the colony are generally poor," he wrote in an 1837 letter to the board. "Being acclimated in receptacles, they were prevented from cultivating any ground. When emigrants are at once placed on their land, this disadvantage is obviated. Owing either to the sickness or negligence of my predecessors in the agency, a large proportion of the emigrants entitled to land, had not drawn it." The last part of his assessment was not fair, however. As early as the mid-1820s, the board and its agents, as well as many colonists, had pushed for settlements along the St. Paul's River, whose rich bottomland was far more conducive to farming than the stone and sand at Meseraudo. And away from the swamps along the coast, the region was also more salubrious. The first new settlement was Caldwell, founded by Ashman, about 20 miles from Monrovia. Lot Carey established Millsburg, another 20 miles upriver from Caldwell, in one of the last acts of his life. By the 1840s, there were settlements up and down the St. Paul and the nearby Junk and St. Johns rivers, though well over half of all settlers still lived in Monrovia and its environs. But expansion did not solve the problem of how to turn bedridden emigrants into productive members of Liberian society. Nor could it resolve a related problem the settlers faced. As the ACS archives reveal, letters emigrants sent home to their masters often included pleas for provisions. "Anything you may choose to send will be acceptable, either dry goods or provision," George McDonough wrote his former master in 1847 with a directness that bespoke his desperation. "The amount of $300 or $500 would be of no consequence to a man of your wealth, and as I find myself so much in need in this hard country and feeling assured that while I was with you I acted upright and just toward you. Even the proud Skipwiths were forced to beg. Please to send us out some flour or anything that yo all have to spar, for we stand in need of something very much," wrote Peyton's oldest daughter, Diana, to Coke's wife, Sally, in 1837, "for we all like to starve this season." For all their wants, though, McDonough and the Skipwiths were luckier than most. The masters who sent them to Liberia were still alive. Emigrants who had been freed in testamentary wills could only plead with the often unsympathetic heirs of their masters. "My dear bro," wrote Peter Ross to the ACS Secretary Ralph Gurley in 1857, "Old Captain Ross leaves $100,000 for his people, and then we cannot get $25 of that money. After he plus seeing the money in the bank, we ask you to be so kind as to intercede for that money for us." Isaac Wade, Ross's grandson and heir, was a mean man. The ACS could prove equally stingy, as Henry Stewart, an emigrant from 1849, attested. The 6 months of provisions he had been provided with lasted barely 3, adults got just 6 pounds of food a week and children only half that, and, from the looks of things, it will have to be a great deal less. This shortfall, he concluded, has been the general complaint in most all the emigrant previous chuos. Joseph Corker, part of an 1840s contingent out of Greenville, Mississippi, learned that complaining to the ACS was fruitless. "I observe the list of goods that you desire me to send you," the ACS official William McLean wrote to Corker in 1849. "But you are very much mistaken if you think I am made out of money." A year earlier, in a communique with the ACS agent in Monrovia, McLean had vented his spleen at the presumptuousness of the Greenville settlers who refused to remain on the land allotted them by the society. "Those who went to Monrovia sent me a beautiful little piece of personal abuse which I trust they may live to become ashamed of," he wrote, before adding, "I entirely approve of the policy of withholding their provisions from them. If emigrants refuse to stay for 6 months after we place them, they must take the responsibility of their own support." There were plenty of reasons why the Greenville emigrants refused to stay in the settlement they had named after their hometown in America. While the ACS promoted Liberia as a land of perpetual summer and fecundity, and in spite of the fact that many of the former slaves had a lifetime of fieldwork behind them, farming did not prove easy. Clearing the land of thick jungle was laborious and, until agricultural practices could be adjusted, the torrential rains wreaked havoc on even the most well-tended settler farm. The lack of draft animals and tools didn't help. "I am still trying to farm," wrote James Skipwith, 2 years after his arrival, "but cannot see but little means and cannot get surf-vision tools." The difficulties of farming in the unfamiliar tropical climate, as well as the sheer isolation and monotony of life in the upriver settlements, led many emigrants to choose the city, which baffled some white observers. It is really astonishing that newcomers should prefer to remain in Monrovia, with 1/4 of an acre of rocky land, when they might have 10 acres of as good land as any other in the world, in a much more healthy location, wrote the physician J. W. Lucian Beale, a choice he attributed to ignorance and fanciful notions excited by seeing some fine-looking houses, occupied by well-dressed persons, who live in pretty handsome style. Emigrant fantasies notwithstanding, the capital had its share of problems beyond poverty and ever-present disease. As Lucian Beale noted, Monrovia bred drones, loafers, in the community and obstacles to the prosperity of Liberia. Even worse, at least as far as the ACS and its agents were concerned, was that many settlers saw the lure of the fast buck and easy living as synonymous with commerce. Despite Monrovia's marginality to the transatlantic trading network, it would wait until after World War II, and a U.S. aid project, for a deep-water port. The Liberian littoral offered opportunities for entrepreneurial middlemen. Products of the forest, such as palm oil and camwood, a source of red dye, could be bartered for manufactures and crops, tobacco especially, from the Americas and Europe. Coastal tribes had long engaged in such trade, along with that in slaves, but now found themselves being muscled aside by the colonists. Indeed, nothing aggravated the colony's white overseers more than settlers abandoning the hoe for the ledger. Most white Americans believed that blacks were best suited for agriculture and manifestly unfit for commerce. But there was more to the ACS officials' hostility to colonial trade than racist assumptions. From its beginning, the society had been dominated by Southern planters and politicians like Koch, most of whom subscribed to the Jeffersonian ideal of a freeholding republic of small farmers. In debt to merchants themselves, many held the profession in contempt as a parasitical one that created nothing. As country farmers, they also remained suspicious of cities, an attitude reinforced by the tendency of free blacks to gravitate to urban areas where, in the imaginations of white Southerners, they indulged their instincts for immorality, criminality, and indolence. The ACS thus saw the growth of Monrovia and Liberian trade as obstacles to the colony's long-term prospects and even its survival. Some of the naval officers who have been here, Monrovia, before, Nicholson wrote in his 1837 report, tell me that it is evidently not so prosperous as it was at their former visit, which I would ascribe to the neglect of agriculture for the pursuit of trade. Some colonists had similar reservations about their society and economy. The present state of affairs here is not very flattering, wrote Moses Jackson from the settlement of Kentucky, like many, named for the place where its inhabitants hailed from. The people here, from all that I have seen and heard, take but little interest in the improvement of the country. They generally engage in trading with the natives for camwood and palm oil, which they barter agone for such things as they need with merchant vessels, and neglect almost entirely the cultivation of the ground. But for many former slaves who had endured years of back-breaking plantation labor, trade, like Liberia itself, meant freedom. Not to mention that it could mean wealth, too. Augustus Addy, a U.S. Navy surgeon, described one merchant's table as positively groaning beneath a display of delicacies. We were greatly astonished to find a large table richly furnished for 30 or more persons. Ragouts, roast beef, Muscovy ducks, porter, spirituous liquors, Madeira, were freely circulated. Paw-paw, pies, African cherry tarts, pineapples, bananas, coffee and cigars finished the repast. With the exception of the tropical products, all of these items had been imported at great cost, and at a time when there was genuine hunger in the colony. Little wonder that so many settlers aspired to the life of the merchant. One dire effect of a largely urban population obsessed with trade was a greater reliance on purchased foodstuffs, which inflated their cost. High prices were the most frequent source of complaint among settlers in their letters home. "The things here sell very dear," Diana Skipwith notified her former mistress in 1837. "Yo cannot get so much as one fowl, without giving 25 cents for it." And when fighting broke out with and among the natives, goods could not be had for any price, resulting in shortages and even starvation. Native leaders understood this and at times enforced embargoes as a means of negotiation. In the early 1840s, one embargo nearly plunged the colonists at Maryland, Liberia's southernmost settlement, into war with the local Grebo people, a conflict narrowly avoided by the arrival of a U.S. naval squadron and a timely cannon salute by a young Commodore Matthew Perry, who would use a similar ploy to force open the ports of Japan a decade later. In an 1843 letter to her former mistress, Diana Skipwith, Peyton's daughter, noted how the Africans call us, the settlers, all white man. In fact, most used Americans Orqui, a Crew term that meant essentially the same thing. And from their perspective, it made sense. The settlers lived, talked, and acted like white men, from their climate-inappropriate woolens and the pungent odor it lent them to the strange courtesies they paid their womenfolk. They caused trouble like white men, too. Their very presence led to violence that would not have been out of place on the contemporary U.S. frontier. In the middle years of the 19th century, thanks in part to the settlers themselves, the Liberian hinterland was riven by fighting. The colonists' expansion into the interior displaced villages and even whole tribes, setting off internecine warfare among the natives. At the same time, their efforts to combat the slave trade provoked chiefs into attacking outlying colonial settlements. In his plea to the ACS chief, Ralph Gurley, for help in getting some of the Ross inheritance, George Jones, another of Ross's manumitted slaves, wrote, "From the coastal settlement of Louisiana, Teehee native have burn our houses and destroy our farm and all the produce and we got no help at all." It was stories like this that drove the emigrant George McDonough to ignore his former master's explicit instructions to bypass Monrovia and take up farming at Senowe, a coastal settlement about 100 miles southeast of the colonial capital. McDonough was convinced by family members already settled in the colonial capital that should he go to Senowe, the natives would take up arms against them. Yet settler-native relations were not always so bellicose. The two sides traded with each other, often to the advantage of the colonists. The settlers endured periods of famine with the help of native produce. Though settler agriculture gradually improved, it was never quite adequate to feed the growing settler community. Teehee Colony has made some effort to exonerate herself from hunger by a few of our ablest men turning their attentions to agriculture, Skipwith wrote to Coke in 1839, but before that we could have hardly thought that we could have existed, for our dependence was mostly on the tribes of the country. Apart from the trade for food, some Monrovia merchants made small fortunes trading goods from Europe and America for forest products gathered by the natives. Many Africans also came to live and work in Monrovia and the other colonial settlements. The streets are full of these fellows, who walk about in their native costume, and native dignity, exhibiting the most perfect proportions of body and limbs, the Navy surgeon Addy admiringly wrote after an 1827 visit. So may wear a few yards of cloth thrown over their shoulders in the manner of the Roman toga. Their bodies and faces are marked with various figures according to the customs of their respective tribes. Around their necks, wrists and ankles they wear ornaments of different kind, as leopards or tigers, teeth, rings of iron or brass, ram's horns, compositions of clay and sea. Sewn in a small bag, which the perceptive Addy called their deities, or rather substances in which their guardian spirit resides. Native children lived among the settlers as well. Raised in the enforced ignorance of slavery, the settlers valued education and established schools in new settlements as quickly as they could. Native chiefs and parents, recognizing that the colonists, some literate, many of them technically proficient and knowledgeable about the encroaching outside world, had much to offer, sent their most talented children to these schools. The chiefs and parents may have gotten more than they bargained for. I have 16 promising, native and settler, students whom I have been teaching since 1st of January 1849. H.W. Ellis reported to the ACS Secretary William McLean of the high school he taught at in Monrovia. The greater part of them have read through the Historia Sacrae, and are making rapid progress in Greek. Besides other sciences, the minds of youth in Africa are, if possible, more susceptible of literary and scientific improvement than any other part of the world, though he lamented the fact that his pupils cannot study intensely, no more than 7 or 8 hours in 24. A few native children and adults were also educated in Christianity. But the proselytizing results in those early years of settlement were surely disappointing to both the ACS and the more evangelical settlers. Converting Africans to Christianity had, after all, been one of the two missions, along with the moral regeneration of free blacks and freed slaves, motivating the Liberian experiment. Like Lot Carey, most settlers were simply so busy trying to survive that they had little time or energy to devote to saving native souls. The preachers among the emigrants were forced to focus more on the settlers. With the death rate so high and the lures of freedom so enticing, They had their hands full comforting the bereft and keeping the wayward out of trouble. That left the task of conversion to visiting missionaries, both white and black. But their task was not an easy one. Traveling to the interior was an ordeal full of danger. The hinterland tribes did not appreciate interlopers who might disturb long-standing trade, both of the legitimate and illegitimate kinds. Bishop Scott, sent by American Methodists to report on the church's missionary efforts in Liberia, found that few natives were open to conversion, though he was quick to add that this was not due to any want of faithfulness on the part of the missionaries. The missionaries also had to compete with another aggressive, evangelizing religion. For centuries, Mandingo traders, like their counterparts throughout the Muslim world, spread the faith along with their goods as they traveled the footpaths of West Africa. Among their converts was nearly the entire Vai tribe, which inhabited much of the hinterland just north of Monrovia. Conversions that did occur were usually the result of a peculiar aspect of settler-native contact known as the ward system, which arose in the early years of colonization and persisted well into the 20th century. Wedding African custom, Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence, and the survival strategies African Americans had forged across generations of slavery, the ward system saw native parents and communities send their sons and daughters to live with settler families. The complex political geography of West Africa had long made alliances necessary, as the Liberians quickly came to understand. These often involved the exchange of children, with chiefly sons and daughters sent to rival tribes and clans to secure peace, trade, and general goodwill. The ward aspect came from English and American legal traditions for dealing with the orphans when death was such a common occurrence. Slavery, particularly in North America, where the law granted masters the right to break up marriages and families at will, led adults to informally adopt children who were not blood relations. So common was adoption of natives that the Colonial Council drew up rules in 1838 to regulate the practice. The adopters had to get prior consent, provide their wards with suitable clothing, and make sure they were instructed in some day school at least 3 months in each year. The adopted, in turn, were expected to obey their guardians, perform chores in return for food and lodging, and behave like civilized Christians. To ensure that its regulations were followed, the council appointed 2 suitable persons to keep an eye on the wards, while guardians were expected to have the wards forthwith entered as free citizens in the colonial records. This last stipulation would prove crucial to the course of Liberian history. Native children, legally absorbed into the settler community, augmented its ranks, which were constantly being depleted by disease. Over time and into the 20th century, wards grew up identifying with the descendants of the settlers, helping the latter to maintain their rule over the natives even though they never exceeded a few percent of Liberia's population. Were the ward rules of 1838 written to regulate existing practice or to rectify a widespread problem? Was abuse of wards rare or widespread? The historical record is mixed. In the close confines of a settler home, with natives and colonists interacting on a daily basis, adults could be tyrannical or tender. In an 1832 letter to her sister in the United States, Eliza Hatter wrote about her mutually beneficial relationship with her ward. "I keep a native girl 10 years old, for her victuals and clothes. I have taught her to read and sew, and she assists me in cooking and cleaning." But one white colonial physician abhorred the ward system. "These pawns," the doctor wrote, using another term for wards, "are as much slaves as their sable prototypes in the parent states of America." More troubling still was the treatment of native adults who came to Monrovia and other settlements to work. As Peyton Skipwith wrote in his first letter home, "Those settlers that are well off do have the natives as Slavs, and poor people that come from America have no chance to make a living, for the natives do all the work." Hostile observers, like the abolitionist William Nesbitt, threw about the dreaded S-word with abandon. Every colonist keeps native slaves, or as they term them servants, about him, varying in number from 1 to 15, according to the circumstances of the master. These poor souls they beat unmercifully, and more than half starve them, and all the labor that is done at all, is done by these poor wretches. The possibility that former slaves subjected their African brethren to servitude in the lash remains a disturbing one almost 2 centuries later. Again, the circumstantial evidence offers a mixed picture. On the one hand, the colonists did not have a powerful state behind them to enforce the harsher aspects of a slave regime. African natives in Liberia were not isolated an ocean away from their homeland. They could and did readily pack up and leave the settlements if conditions became intolerable. On the other hand, natives displaced by war or famine often had no alternative but to work in the colony. And there is little question that native labor was cheap and readily available. Laborers can be hired in Liberia for 25 cents per day and the outside from $3 to $4 per month. Matilda Skipwith Lomax, another of Peyton's daughters, happily wrote to her former master. "One thing we do know, natives were never legally recognized as slaves, as that would have been a violation of every constitution written by and for the colony. It is something strange to think that these people of Africa are called our ancestors," Skipwith wrote to Cook in a contemplative letter some half-dozen years after his arrival. "In my present thinking, if we have any ancestors, they could not have been like these hostile tribes in this part of Africa, for you may try and distill that principle and belief in them and do all you can for them, and they still will be your enemy." The Skipwith who wrote this disillusioned letter had only recently returned from a military campaign against King Gatumbe, one of the more hostile chieftains of the Monrovian hinterland. Like many settlers, Skipwith's attitude toward the natives consisted of equal parts fear, anger, contempt, and paternalistic concern. He looked down on the Africans as lazy and duplicitous. When put to work, they had to be watched or they would slack off. They had no respect for property. In one letter, Skipwith lumped the natives together with monkeys as crop thieves. Skipwith's attitude sounds all too familiar, to us if not to the former slaves and freedmen who embodied it. Yet the settlers' racial outlook could be more nuanced than it at first appears. Skipwith may have been unable to overcome the prejudices his homeland had imbued in him, but his daughter Diana, just 12 years old when she first landed in Monrovia, could, to a degree. In conversing with one of the natives, she wrote her mistress in 1843, "I asked him how was it that the Y could not read and write like white man, and he said it was their own fault, that God give them the choice either to learn book proper as they says or make rice, and they told God they had rather make rice. I labored with him and told him that it was a mistaken idea altogether. God had blessed them with as many senses as the white man, and if they were to only put them in exercise that would be the same as white man." Diana reported that she had won the native to her side and then voiced the same paternalist sentiments that had inspired her former master and mistress 2 generations earlier. "I think by Thea's means we will be able to get them out of their superstitious ideas, and at last they will become civilized." The Africans, too, had their hopes and doubts. The coastal people resented the settlers' encroachment on their land and their middleman position between European traders and the interior tribes. Nor did they enjoy being bossed around by the newcomers. One fact is this: the Cape Palmas settler Alexander Hans wrote to the head of the Maryland Colonization Society, in a letter that demonstrates that Diana Skipwith's experience with the natives was not entirely representative. "The natives do not like to be governed by a colored man, and they do just as they please almost. But the settlements did offer certain advantages. Natives could trade with settlers for tobacco, machine-woven cloth, mirrors, and other coveted goods from across the sea. And because the colonists manifested a degree of military discipline, a number of villages and a few of the weaker tribes sought refuge under the guns of the Cape." By the time James Skipwith, Peyton's nephew, migrated to Liberia in the late 1850s, a modus vivendi had emerged between settler and native. There would still be many misunderstandings and conflicts in the future, but most of the neighboring tribes had come to recognize that the colonists could not be driven out by force. Relations improved as a result of the decline of slave smuggling, a result of increased British patrols as well as the military campaigns undertaken by the colonists themselves. But James insisted the new comedy rested on a more benevolent foundation. "The natives are more and more friendly," he wrote to Cook in 1859. "Their confidence begins to awaken. They see that it is our wish to do them good, and hostilities have ceased with them. We have daily applications to receive their children into our church and Sabbath school. 4 of the converts are natives of this country and are filled with the Holy Ghost." It was a hopeful assessment, but not a very convincing or far-seeing one. The conversion statistic he cited hardly made his case, not to mention that those wards who came to live among the settlers and adopt their religion represented a tiny sliver of the overall African population of the hinterland. As for the wars between natives and settlers, far from having ceased, they would continue well into the 20th century, and over much the same things that had always sparked them: trade, land, and settler arrogance. Over time, Peyton slowly came to terms with life in Africa, though it took all of his willpower. The idea of being in a new country with a large family of helpless children, who could depend only on me for support, and I being so indisposed as to be of no use to them, nor myself having no means, and the prospect of their suffering made me feel distressed, and greatly so, he wrote to Cook 2 years after his arrival. "But thanks be to God, my health and sight is recovered, and that day of awful gloom is gone, and I feel satisfied with my present home and desire no other." Although he and his family continued to be plagued with health problems, such are the diseases of a tropical climate, they began to prosper as the colony grew. Because the mercantile elite preferred to build their homes and warehouses of stone, Peyton's skills as a mason made possible his ascent up the social ladder. He sent his children to school, some in buildings he himself had helped construct. His son Nash followed him into the masonry business, though he died in his 20th year. Sometime around 1840, Peyton remarried, this time to a devout Methodist woman 20 years his junior named Margaret Skinner. Still, the sense of isolation and separation persisted. Peyton, and particularly his daughters, missed friends and family back home. Diana had been especially close to her master's daughter. "I cannot take rest of nights dreaming about you," she wrote to Sally Coke in 1838. "Sometimes I think I am there, and when I awake I am here in Liberia, and how that does grieve me, but I cannot help myself. I am very afraid I shall never see your face again, but if I never do I hope I shall meet you in the kingdom." Diana's letters, like those of many of the settlers, particularly the women, were filled with appeals for news about loved ones and requests that her tender wishes be passed on to others. Inevitably, the homesickness faded with time. Diana and her sister Matilda married and started families of their own, though not until they had found appropriate partners in their social class. Diana, for all her political correctness, refused to marry an African. Peyton's consolation for the difficulties of his life in Liberia came in part from his rising status in the colony. As more and more of Coke's slaves were manumitted and sent to Liberia, he took on the role of paterfamilias. His modest financial success allowed the family to live comfortably in a fine house on a town lot he had purchased with his own earnings. He developed friendships with some of the eminent individuals of Monrovian society and was appointed an officer in the colonial militia, a highly coveted post that marked him as a man of note in the tiny settler community. But not everyone in the Skipwith family found a similar measure of contentment. I am sorry to say that Erasmus, Skipwith, Peyton's younger brother, is displeased with the country because he is of no trade, and therefore he sees no way to make a living, Peyton wrote to Coke in 1846. "I wanted him to come in and learn the mason's trade, but I could not prevail on him enough to get his consent." When the son of one of Coke's planter neighbors, an officer aboard the U.S. Navy brig Porpoise, offered the young man a steward's position, Erasmus took it. James Nicholas, a former slave of Coke's deceased sister Sally Falcon, left the colony for Jamaica in 1844, just 2 years after his arrival in Monrovia. Brother James could not content himself here, a sibling explained to Coke. James was never heard from again, which was not unusual. According to the ACS's own records, more than 500 colonists, or roughly 1 in 9 emigrants, left Liberia for other destinations between 1821 and the first colony-wide census in 1843. Most went to the West Indies or joined the ranks of African American seamen, or blackjacks. A few ended up in other parts of Africa, usually Sierra Leone or the Maryland Colonization Society's independent settlement at Cape Palmas. Some even returned to the United States. All who left were lamented both by family members and by a community concerned for its own survival, except for this last group. These failed emigrants drew the ire of those who remained in Africa because they appeared to undermine Liberia's very reason for existence, as a refuge for the persecuted free man of color. When two brothers returned to the United States in the late 1850s, complaining of Liberia as a hell of high prices and broken promises, the Reverend James Wilson fired back, "As for my part I do not know what William and James Watson returned for unless it was for the whip." The minister wrote to the ACS Secretary William McLean. "It cannot be for something to eat, for we have a variety of foods, to teach us to men on. I cannot see what a man of color want to go back to the United States to live for unless he has no soul in him, for far a thire is a sign of a soul within a man at pants, for freedom in this life and the life to come." As the years passed and the colony grew, the settlers began to test that freedom. White men still ran Liberia. Many of the more successful residents, while appreciative of the ACS's efforts on their behalf, chafed under its authority, even after the colony became a semi-autonomous commonwealth in 1838 and one of their own was appointed governor 3 years later. A Liberian national identity began to emerge, a pride in what black men and women had achieved in the land of their forefathers despite the intolerable harshness and deprivation of their upbringing. Writing to his former mistress in 1846, Abraham Blackford bespoke a fierce patriotism. "People speaking about this country tell them to hush their mouths if they are speaking anything disrespectful of it. Africa is the very country for the colored man." A year later, Blackford, Skipwith, and several thousand of their fellow colonists announced to the world their freedom from the ACS, an act that had been in the making since the agent Samuel Bacon had informed the first colonists during the voyage of the Elizabeth that the white agents, not the colonists, were in charge. In coming to the shores of Africa, their Declaration of Independence read, "We indulge the pleasing hope that we would be permitted to exercise and improve those faculties which impart to man his dignity, to nourish in our hearts the flame of honorable ambition, to cherish and indulge these aspirations which a beneficent Creator had implanted in every human heart, and to evince to all who despise, ridicule, and oppress our race that we possess with them a common nature, are with them susceptible of equal refinement, and capable to equal advancement in all that adorns and dignifies man. The high ideals and soaring prose masked the underlying reason for the split, which was not so different from the cause of the American Revolution 70 years before. Liberia's struggle for independence had as much to do with taxes, and who paid them, as it did with freedom.